This chapter will be dedicated to minor piece endgames. So that means endgames where we have a knight or a bishop and some pawns and or kings, but no rooks and no queens are left on the board. So if you've seen the previous courses and chapters, you already know that if we have a queen left, we can win. If we have a rook, we can win as well. And if we have a pawn or some pawns, we can promote them into queens and then win the remaining game. But bishops and knights cannot deliver checkmate on their own, so king plus knight or king plus bishop versus an only king is a draw. And this allows for a resource that I've seen way too many beginners and casual players overlook in these types of endgames. So, for instance, here if it's white to play, they could make a move like pawn to g7, but this would be a huge mistake. Why is that the case? Well, it's bad because black can do the theoretically or in principle unfavorable trade of a bishop for a pawn to get a position where they will never lose. So they just take the pawn, and after the king takes back, this position is indeed a draw. So going back, this means that these types of endgames are usually about whether the size that is down on material can sacrifice their bishop or their knight to take the final pawn or final pawns of the opponent. So here, white can indeed win the game, but they cannot simply just push the pawns and force the opponent to sacrifice, because that would be a draw. That would work with rooks or with queens, but not with bishops. So what do they have to do instead? They need to block the bishop's way to stop this possibility of a sacrifice, and only then push the pawn. In this case, they can achieve that by giving this check. King has to move, and now we block the diagonal. Now it doesn't matter what black does. If they move the bishop away, white can simply advance. So the only possibility we have to worry about is what happens if black takes. But here we take, and the king just has not enough time to arrive to the defense. So king here, white can push, and this square is covered, so the pawn will promote. So if you go back to the beginning of this position, we can see that the way white wins is by putting a blocker to the opponent's bishop, so get somebody in the way. And in this case, we had a bishop. We could have had a knight arriving this square. But this leads to the question, what happens if the bishops are moving on opposite color squares? So if we had a light squared bishop instead of a dark squared one. And here you have it. This position is indeed a draw, because no matter how many moves we make, we will never be able to establish a barrier here. We won't get in the other bishop's way. So we can just move the pieces around forever, and black just waits along the diagonal, and we will simply never be able to, well, this is a check, so we move. We will simply never be able to get in the way. So no matter what we do, there's no stopping the bishop from sacrificing itself. Eventually, white will have to push, and black just takes, and this is a simple draw. And in fact, opposite colored bishops lead to unbelievably drawish endgames, to the point where sometimes not even two pawns are enough. And you can see it in this position, where black is targeting one of the pawns, so the king has to stay defending it, because this bishop will never be able to. Here black can achieve a draw just by waiting and doing nothing, so we just move the bishop. Of course, if white pushes this pawn, black simply takes, and well, recapturing would lead to a draw, and there's really no way to get out of this now. So let's say white tries to go around, maybe activate the king a bit more and find some resource, but as you can see, there's really no way to advance. This is still answered by a sacrifice, and this will be answered with a strong blockade by the bishop on e6. So here we just go to the strategy of waiting forever, like we did before, and neither pawn will ever get to advance again. Okay, so let's go back here and say we try to move the king through the other way, but at some point, if we want to keep moving the king, either here or here, this pawn has to be protected somehow, and by pushing it to a dark square, black just builds this blockade that stays permanently there. There's no way to push this pawn without it getting captured, and the king will forever stay here because it cannot get kicked out by a check. When we don't have opposite colored bishops, two pawns are usually enough to win, but you gotta be careful. So, for instance, in this situation, black has a horrible knight with no moves. The king is holding the position somehow, but not really a great piece either. And still, white has to be careful because a careless move like pawn to c6 will be replied in, you're going to tell me which way should it be replied. Well, of course, black will simply sacrifice the knight to capture this pawn, and if it gets recaptured, this is a draw, so the only option is to play something else, but now it's only one pawn instead of two, so black will figure out a way to sacrifice the knight for just one pawn or to hold the position somehow. So what white should do is supporting the advance of the pawns even more. So we bring the king to d5, yet again the theme of king activation, and now we are ready to push. So against any move, we can still push, and if black tries to go chase this pawn, note that it's defended, so no real problem here. We can keep advancing, and eventually we just push our pawn. We always have to be careful about the sacrifices. For instance, this here doesn't work because we still have a living pawn, but it's something that we have to keep in mind every time. Finally, I want to show you a position where a bishop and a pawn are not enough to win, and this is what we call the wrong rook pawn, or the wrong side pawn. So it's called a rook pawn because it starts on the file where the rook stands at the beginning. So it's either the h pawn or the a pawn. And notice that this promotion square is dark and our bishop moves on the light squares. It's a light squared bishop. So this position is a draw. There's no way to kick this king out of the corner. And if we try, we will just stalemate it. So let's say we give a check. Now we have to get the bishop out of this diagonal, otherwise it will be stalemate. I mean, we could retreat with the king, but then the opponent's king just moves back and forth. So let's move the bishop instead. And if we try to check to kick the king away with the pawn instead of with the bishop, he just goes to the corner, and now this is going to be a stalemate no matter what we play. So this is a stalemate, or any king move other than maybe going back is still a stalemate. Here the king just, well, this move loses the pawn, but the king can just move to these two squares, and the moment we stopping, it's a stalemate. Notice that this doesn't happen. There's no stalemate if this is a central pawn. So if the pawn were standing on any other file, this could be a win. And if it were standing on the A file with this light squared bishop, it would also be a win. So that you can imagine, if this was a dark squared bishop checking in this diagonal, we could kick the king away. But since it's on a light square, there's no way to kick it out. All right, so this has been it for bishop and knight endgames, very basic ones. We'll dedicate a chapter now to rook endgames, where This main theme of trying to sacrifice a piece for the opponent's last pawns won't really work, because we do have an option to win with a king and a rook if we know the pattern we learned on chapter 1. So this will make us explore other aspects of rook endgames, given that the result of just king and rook versus king is already known. So we will have to stop the opponent's pawns in other ways.